Hi, everybody. So in the first lesson of this unit, you were supposed to learn the definition of an ecosystem and some other definitions as well. And so as you may know, an ecosystem is composed of both living things and non-living things, and they're always interacting with each other in a nice balanced way. And one of those interactions is as simple as eating and getting eaten. Okay, so that's one of the main ways of interacting with other species in an ecosystem. And that's going to be described through something called a food chain. So the lesson for today is food chains. Okay, so first things first, all living things need energy to survive. Okay, you need energy to survive. You get your energy by eating a lot of food. Okay, you eat a bunch of calories per day, and that's the energy for you to be able to do the different things that you do with your body. Um, so you would be classified as a consumer. Okay, we would be classified as consumers. So consumers are organisms that get their energy by eating food or consuming food. That's why it's called consumers. So most animals are consumers. And there's a picture of a rabbit eating some green stuff there. All right, not everything is a consumer. There's got to be something that starts us all off. Like something at the base, and those things are called producers. So producers are organisms capable of making their own food using energy from the sun. Or in other words, they produce their own food, so that's why they're called producers. And most plants are producers. So you may know that plants such as trees and grass and flowers and all of that, they can actually capture the energy from sunlight and turn them into their own food. And that food is called glucose or sugar. Okay, so plants are made up of cells, like everything is made up of cell, or all living things are made up of cells, and cells need food, they need sugar to survive. Well, plants can create this sugar themselves using sunlight. Animals can't. Animals have to get their sugar from eating things that have sugar in it. All right, so those are the first two words to learn from this lesson: consumers and producers. So next is the definition for a food chain. So I've described a food chain as a sequence of organisms that shows the transfer of energy from one organism to the next with arrows. So the word sequence means something in order. Okay, a sequence is something in order. So this picture is showing the order of one organism getting eaten by the next organism, which gets eaten by the next organism, which gets eaten by the next organism, and which gets eaten by the last organism in the food chain. Okay, so a sequence is something in order, and in a food chain, you're supposed to draw arrows that point in the direction of what does the eating, or it points in the direction of which way the energy is going. So this is showing the energy from the grass is going into the grasshopper because the grasshopper eats it. And then the energy in a grasshopper goes to a frog because the frog eats it. I get a lot of food chains and food webs, which we'll talk about in the next lesson, where the students have drawn the arrows backwards. All right, you cannot just draw them whichever way you want. They're supposed to point in the direction that the energy is going. Or it should go in the direction of the bigger thing. That may be another way to think about it. It goes into the direction of the bigger thing. All right, all of these organisms in a food chain, we say they occupy a position. We say they occupy a position on a food chain. And now scientists get a little bit tricky. They have certain words that they use to describe the position of an organism on a food chain. So I'm just going to tell you what those words are, that terminology, in order from left to right here. So starting with grass, you actually already know this word, producer. Okay, so the bottom of a food chain is always a producer, but now we're also going to call it the first trophic level. The first trophic level. So trophic comes from a Greek root word that stands for nourishment or nutrition. So since it's at the bottom of the food chain, it's kind of like the source of that nourishment. So we're going to call that the first trophic level. And then when we go up to the grasshopper, well, you may guess that that's going to be called the second trophic level. And it is. So the grasshopper, I've labeled it as the second trophic level. It gets its nourishment from the first trophic level, the producer. All right, the grasshopper is also called a consumer because it eats food to get its energy. But we're going to add one more word to that. We're going to call it the primary consumer. So primary means first. So the grasshopper is the first thing in this food chain that's a consumer. It's not the first thing in the food chain, that would be grass. It's the first thing that eats to get its energy. So we call it the primary consumer. We can also call a grasshopper a herbivore. A herbivore. So a herbivore is any organism that eats plants only. And now I'll move on to the frog. So if the grasshopper was the primary consumer, then the frog is going to be called the secondary consumer. So the words just kind of go in order. Secondary means second. If the grass was the first trophic level, the grasshopper is the second trophic level, then the frog is the third trophic level. So this is where students get a little confused because it's the secondary consumer, so you're thinking second, but it's the third trophic level, so now you're thinking third. Okay, so consumer levels are different than trophic levels, and you kind of have to get that sorted out in your brains. Furthermore, some consumers are called carnivores. Carnivores are organisms that only eat animals. So I think a frog only eats insects, so they're considered carnivore. I do not think frogs eat any plants. So what if you have an animal that eats both plants and animals? Like human beings, for example, unless you're a vegan, you eat both plants and animals. Well, those are called omnivores. An omnivore eats both plants and animals. So examples would be humans, or raccoons, or bears. They'll eat both plants and animals. All right, now we get to the snake, and we're just gonna go one level up. So I'm gonna start with trophic level. If the grass was the first trophic level, the grasshopper was the second trophic level, the frog is the third trophic level, then the snake is going to be the fourth trophic level. Now, what about the consumer level? So the grasshopper was the primary consumer, then the frog was the secondary consumer. So now the snake is going to be the word is tertiary. It's not thirdiary. The word is tertiary consumer. So that might be a new word for you. Tertiary is what comes after secondary. All right, and a snake would also be considered a carnivore. It eats animals only. And then finally, we get to the hawk. So the hawk is the last thing in this food chain. It'll eat the snake. But you know what? The hawk is so powerful in this food chain that nothing will eat it. So we call that a top carnivore, okay? If it's at the top of the food chain and nothing can eat it, while it's alive at least, then we call it a top carnivore. And for the trophic levels, we just follow from the one previous. So it's the 4th trophic level for the hawk. All right, so the new words you have to learn are primary, secondary, and tertiary consumer, and top carnivore. As well, you need to learn about the trophic levels and how they're numbered in the food chain. And then you need to know the words herbivore, carnivore, and omnivore. Now, energy passing through a food chain. So most food chains have what we describe as a 10% trophic efficiency. A 10% trophic efficiency. That means that from one trophic level to the next, the amount of energy contained within that trophic level is actually only 10% as much. So for example, if we look at how much energy grass has, and we'll just call that 100%, this is all of the grass in the whole ecosystem. We call that 100% of energy. Then we take a look at how much energy all the grasshoppers in the ecosystem have. Well, according to this rule or guideline, the grasshoppers are only going to have 10% as much energy as the grass does. And if we go to the next trophic level, it goes to 10% of that. So all the frogs in the ecosystem are actually going to have 10% of the energy as the grasshoppers. So what's 10% of 10%? Well, that's only 1%. And it goes even less for the snake and even less for the hawks in the ecosystem. You may be confused with percentages, so I'll use actual numbers. So let's say that all the grass in the ecosystem have 500,000 units of energy. 500,000 units of energy. Well, then the grasshoppers are only going to have 10% of that. And that just means you chop off a 0 from the number. So the grasshoppers only have 50,000 units of energy. And then the frogs only have 10% of that. So you chop off another 0, and it has 5,000 units of energy for the frogs. The snakes have only 10% of that. So you chop off another 0. And the hawks have the least amount of energy. You chop off another 0. So because of this 10% trophic efficiency rule, this means that there's going to be a huge population of grass. If you count how many grasses there are in an ecosystem, millions and millions of grasses. So they're going to have the largest population because they have the most energy. And there's going to be a lot of grasshoppers in the ecosystem, but not nearly as many grasshoppers as there are blades of grass. And then frogs, there may be a lot of frogs, but less than the number of grasshoppers. I'll go all the way to the end here. The hawks are going to have the smallest population in this food chain or this ecosystem. Since they have so little energy compared to all the other trophic levels, that means there are not going to be that many hawks in this ecosystem compared to the rest of them. All right, and finally, 2 more words to know are scavengers and decomposers. So both of these organisms will eat dead organisms. Okay, they will both eat the remains of dead organisms. We use 2 different words because scavengers normally feed on larger pieces of dead organisms. So these would be things like vultures or cockroaches and some worms. They will eat and break down some of the larger pieces of dead organisms. And they'll break them down into smaller pieces. And then they can't break them down any further. Well, then it goes to the decomposers. The decomposers will take care of those really small pieces. And they will eat them, and they will break them down. They will break them down into nutrients that go back to the ecosystem. So those dead bodies still have some nutrients. It would be nice if they can get recycled into the ecosystem, and decomposers help to do that. Some examples are bacteria, fungus like mushrooms, and some worms as well.